So this is the first in 3 videos on the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. This is kind of a good transition for us from the absolutism we were talking about before to the changes we see in European governments during the Enlightenment. So kind of a reminder of what the political situation and the government situation is like in England. Way back in 1215, the nobility of England forced King John, who was doing a real bad job, to sign this document called the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta did was it guaranteed certain rights for, at first, just the nobility, but later all other English people. That said that they had to consent to taxes, that they had right to trial by a jury of their peers, etc., etc. And this really forms almost the first sort of Bill of Rights for England. And later, this sort of gets formalized into this group called Parliament. Parliament was a bicameral legislature. It consists of 2 houses: the House of Lords, the nobility, and House of Commons, everybody else. And their job was to meet when the king requested them, so they could do things like raise taxes or change laws, that kind of thing. And so this was a system that had been around for a while, and Parliament played an important role in English governance since then. Now, last time we talked about England, we were with the Tudor dynasty. Remember that Henry VIII over here had his 6 wives, and of those he produced 3 people who would be monarchs of England. His son Edward VI, who died fairly young, and then his older half-sister, Mary, who was married to Philip II of Spain, tried to move England towards Catholicism more. And then we had Elizabeth, probably the most successful of the Tudor monarchs, who really established the Anglican Church and made it what was seen as sort of a compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism. When Elizabeth dies in 1603, she doesn't have any immediate successor because she never married, so she had no children. So then the throne goes, and you follow this red line here, all the way to her somewhat distant cousin, James, who was already king of Scotland. So James gets called down from Scotland, where he's already King James VI of Scotland. And now he takes the title of King James I of England, and he is the first monarch of the Stuart dynasty. James already kind of has a lot of issues when he comes in to England. For one, a lot of English people see him as a foreigner. Scotland was not part of England yet. The United Kingdom doesn't exist for another 100 years. And so he's seen as sort of, he's got kind of a weird accent. He comes from out of town. So a lot of people didn't really trust him. For another, he sort of leaned towards absolutism. He really seemed to like a lot of the ideas in Europe at the time that were developing, that kings should have really total absolute power. He really made it pretty clear in public that he didn't much care for Parliament. And third, he sort of leaned Catholic. Keep in mind, by this point, the monarch of England is head of the Anglican Church, which is a Protestant church. And this is still fairly new at this point. Really, first Henry and then Elizabeth reestablished it. But James comes in, and though he's not practicing Catholic, he tends to favor Catholics. He seemed sort of Catholic-leaning, and that especially made him enemies among the Puritans. We usually think about the Puritans in terms of the colonists who come over to the New World, but Puritanism was really a branch of the Anglican Protestant movement that wanted to purify the Anglican Church. They thought it was too Catholic-looking. They wanted to really make it absolutely pure Calvinist and Protestant. And Puritans at this point in England have a pretty significant influence in Parliament. So when James comes in, they're pretty distrusting of this guy who seems to favor Catholics. And so he reigns for a while, runs into some problems with Parliament, trying to raise taxes, and he's not super popular. And when he dies, his son Charles succeeds him. And Charles is even more so seen as problematic for Parliament. For one, he even more favored Catholics. For another, he also was very absolutist. He very much embraced the idea of absolutism. In this picture I commissioned of himself, you see God literally crowning the king. So he really embraced this idea of divine right. And when he married a French princess, there was this fear that Charles would really move England back towards Catholicism, away from Anglicanism. So the Puritans don't like him for that. But also, he kept running into problems with Parliament. He tried not to meet with them when he could. The few times he did meet with them, he sort of tried to dismiss them as quickly as possible. Basically, raise taxes like I'm asking you to, and then get out of the way. He tried to go around Parliament many times to raise money without meeting with them. For example, selling titles of nobility. And so the next time they met in 1642, Parliament was ready for him. They said, before we sign anything, before we raise taxes, you have to sign this thing called the Petition of Rights. And what the Petition of Rights did was basically require the king to regularly meet with Parliament. Charles, who was kind of in a pickle here, he had to get this tax signed so he could keep fighting his wars, agreed to it, and then pretty soon after just sort of dismissed Parliament anyway, and basically ignored the petition. So later when he meets with them, a few years down the road, when again he has to raise taxes, he meets with Parliament, and Parliament's very suspicious of him, and basically they say, we're not going to do what the king wants. And Charles basically marches into Parliament and orders the guards in the chamber to arrest Parliament members who disagreed with him. And their reaction was to say that, well, we don't work for the king, we work for Parliament. And by this point, you have sort of this roiling disagreement across England between the Puritans and the Royalists who supported the king. And this leads to an outbreak of war, the English Civil War, which we'll talk about in the next video.